The summer heat of 1878 bore down mercilessly on the Texas plains as Josephine Sutton watched her father's funeral procession wind its way up Boot Hill Cemetery. At 22, she hadn't expected to find herself alone in the world, clutching the deed to a ranch she barely knew how to run and nursing a heart that felt as dry and cracked as the drought-stricken land around her. Miss Sutton, the banker, Mr. Willoughby, approached as the last of the mourners drifted away. My sincere condolences. When you're ready to discuss the matter of your father's debts and the sale of the property, there won't be a sale. Josephine interrupted, her voice steadier than she felt. The ranch was all she had left of her father, all she had left of anything. Willoughby's lips thinned beneath his neatly trimmed mustache. With respect, miss, a young woman alone cannot manage the double S. The drought has already taken half your cattle. Your father owed considerable sums. I'm aware of our situation, she said, folding the deed carefully and slipping it into her pocket. And I'll find a way to manage. But as she rode back to the Double S Ranch that evening, the enormity of her challenge loomed before her like the gathering storm clouds on the horizon. The bunkhouse was empty. The few remaining ranch hands had drifted away after her father's illness, sensing the end was near for both the man and his operation. The cattle were scattered across parched pastures, and the creek that ran through the property had dwindled to a trickle. Josephine dismounted in front of the ranch house, a modest two-story structure that had once been filled with her mother's laughter before fever took her when Josephine was just 12. Now it stood silent, save for the creaking of the porch swing in the evening breeze. That night, she knelt beside her bed and did something she hadn't done since she was a child. She prayed, not for salvation or even comfort, but for strength and perhaps, if God was feeling particularly generous, a miracle. The miracle arrived the next morning in the form of a dust cloud on the horizon. Josephine was in the barn, struggling to mend a broken bridle when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the sun, and watched as a rider materialized from the dust. The stranger rode a magnificent chestnut stallion that looked too fine for a drifter, yet the man himself seemed trail-worn. His clothes were dusty, his dark hat pulled low over his eyes, and he sat slightly slumped in his saddle, as though the journey had taken more from him than just time. "Hello, the house," he called, reining in his horse at a respectful distance. Josephine reached for the rifle leaning against the barn door. "State your business," she called back, her voice carrying across the yard. The stranger pushed his hat back, revealing a face that might have been handsome if not for the exhaustion etched into every line. His eyes, when they met hers, were the color of a storm-darkened sky. "Name's Caleb Hayes," he said. "Looking for work if you've got it." "What kind of work?" She kept the rifle visible, but not aimed. "Any kind. I can break horses, mend fences, drive cattle." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Even fix a broken bridle better than you're doing there." Josephine glanced down at the mangled leather in her hands and felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "What makes you think we're hiring?" He gestured toward the empty bunkhouse, the untended fields. "Place this size should have at least half a dozen hands." "I don't see any but you, miss." She hesitated, pride warring with practicality. "The Double S has fallen on hard times, Mr. Hayes. My father just passed, and I can't pay much." "I don't need much," he replied simply. "Just a place to lay my head and honest work." Something in his steady gaze made her believe him, though caution kept her suspicious. "You're running from something." It wasn't a question, and he didn't treat it as one. "Aren't we all, in one way or another?" The philosophical answer surprised her, and she found herself lowering the rifle. "I can offer room in the bunkhouse, meals, and $2 a week. It's all I can manage for now." "That'll do," he said, dismounting with a subtle wince that he quickly masked. "Where would you like me to start?" Over the next week, Josephine watched as Caleb Hayes threw himself into the work of resurrecting the Double S. He rose before dawn and worked until dusk, repairing fences, rounding up the scattered cattle, and cleaning out the irrigation ditches in preparation for the rain that everyone hoped would come. She found herself drawn to the quiet cowboy despite her best intentions. There was something in the careful way he moved, the thoughtful manner in which he approached each task, that spoke of a man who had known hardship but hadn't been broken by it. Yet for all his industry, Josephine noticed troubling signs. The way he sometimes paused in his work, pressing a hand to his side. How he would occasionally sway on his feet when he thought no one was watching. The sheen of sweat that seemed excessive even in the Texas heat. On the 8th day, she found him in the barn, attempting to shoe a fractious mare. The horse was secured in the stall, but Caleb was leaning heavily against the post, his shirt soaked with sweat. "Mr. Hayes." Josephine approached cautiously. "Are you unwell?" He straightened quickly, too quickly, and she saw the flash of pain cross his features before he could hide it. "Just the heat, Miss Sutton. Nothing to concern yourself with." But as he turned to fetch a tool, his legs buckled beneath him. Josephine rushed forward, helping him to a bale of hay where he sat heavily, breath coming in short gasps. "You're ill," she said, laying a hand on his forehead. He was burning up. "How long have you been hiding this?" Caleb attempted to stand again. "It's nothing. Old wound acting up. I'll be fine by tomorrow." "You most certainly will not be fine if you keep working yourself to death," she chided, pressing him back down. "What old wound?" With reluctance, he lifted his shirt to reveal a badly healing gash along his ribs, the skin around it angry and inflamed. "Dear God," Josephine breathed. "That needs tending. How did this happen?" "Disagreement with a man in Dodge City," he said vaguely. "It looked to be healing well enough until a few days ago." "It's infected," she said, already calculating what needed to be done. "Can you make it to the house?" With Josephine supporting him, Caleb managed to stagger to the ranch house, though by the time they reached the porch steps, he was leaning on her heavily. She guided him to her father's old room, helping him onto the bed. "This isn't proper," he murmured, even as he sank gratefully into the mattress. "Propriety can hang," Josephine replied, already gathering bandages and the bottle of whiskey her father had kept for medicinal purposes. "Your health matters more than gossip, and there's no one here to gossip anyway." She cleaned the wound as best she could, her heart sinking at the sight of the angry red streaks spreading outward from the gash. Caleb bore her ministrations stoically, though she could feel the tremors running through his body. "I should ride for the doctor," she said, more to herself than to him. Caleb caught her wrist weakly as she rose. "Don't," he said. "Town's too far. You can't leave the ranch untended, and I've seen worse." "You need a doctor," she insisted. "What I need is rest. The fever will break, or it won't." His eyes, glazed with fever, held hers. "It won't last, Miss Sutton, one way or another." The resignation in his voice frightened her more than his words. "Then I'll stay till it's gone," she said firmly. "Rest now. I'll be back with broth." For 3 days, Josephine barely left Caleb's side. The fever raged, leaving him delirious at times, calling out names she didn't recognize and fighting battles she couldn't see. She bathed his brow with cool water, forced sips of broth and water between his cracked lips, and changed the bandages on his wound, relieved when the angry red streaks began to recede. On the morning of the 4th day, she awoke in the chair beside his bed to find him watching her, his eyes clear for the first time in days. "You're still here," he said, his voice rough but stronger. "I said I would be," she replied, smoothing her rumpled skirts. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo, but I'll live." He attempted to sit up, wincing. "Thanks to you." Josephine helped him, adjusting pillows behind him. "You would have done the same for me." "Yes," he said simply, and something in the way he looked at her made her heart beat faster. "You should eat something. Real food, not just broth," she said, turning away to hide the flush she could feel rising to her cheeks. As Caleb recovered, their relationship began to shift. The formal Miss Sutton and Mr. Hayes gave way to Josephine and Caleb during long evenings on the porch, where they watched the sunset and shared stories of their lives. Josephine learned that Caleb had been a rancher himself once, in Wyoming, until drought and bad luck had forced him to sell. He drifted south after that, taking work where he could find it, a cowboy without a home. "Why did you really come to the Double S?" she asked him one evening, 2 weeks after his fever had broken. "There are bigger spreads that could pay better wages." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "I was in El Paso when I heard about John Sutton passing," he said finally. "Your father and I crossed paths years ago. He helped me when I needed it, never asked for anything in return. When I heard about his death, It seemed right to come and see if I could return the favor. You knew my father? Josephine straightened in surprise. Briefly. I was young, not much more than a boy, working my first cattle drive. Got separated from the herd during a storm. Would have died if your father hadn't found me. His eyes met hers. He was a good man, Josephine. Yes, she said softly. He was. As July turned to August, the ranch began to show signs of revival under their combined efforts. The cattle were gathered and counted, the fences mended, and when the rains finally came, they were ready. The creek swelled with fresh water, and the parched land began to green. Banker Willoughby rode out one afternoon, clearly expecting to find Josephine ready to sell. His surprise at the improvements was evident, as was his disapproval of her living arrangement with Caleb, even though he stayed in the bunkhouse now that he was recovered. "This is most irregular, Miss Sutton," Willoughby said as they stood on the porch. "A young woman alone with a hired hand of unknown character people are talking." "Let them talk," Josephine replied coolly. "Mr. Hayes has been instrumental in saving this ranch, and I won't entertain gossip about him or myself. Nevertheless, appearances matter. Your father would be concerned. My father would be grateful that the double S still stands, Mr. Willoughby." She met his gaze steadily. "Was there something else you needed?" The banker left disgruntled, but his visit left a shadow over Josephine's mood. That evening, as she and Caleb sat on the porch, she was quieter than usual. "Something troubling you?" Caleb asked, his voice gentle in the gathering dusk. Josephine hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Willoughby thinks it's improper for me to be here alone with you." "Oh." Caleb's expression was unreadable in the fading light. "He's not wrong, by society's standards. Society's standards would have me sell the ranch and find a husband to take care of me," she said with a touch of bitterness. "I've never much cared for society's standards." Caleb chuckled, the sound warming her. "That doesn't surprise me. Still," she continued, "it made me realize I've never asked what your plans are. Will you stay on at the Double S? Or is this just a stopping place for you?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Caleb was silent for so long that Josephine thought he might not answer. "I hadn't planned to stay," he said finally. "But plans change." Their eyes met in the twilight, and Josephine felt something shift between them, a current of feeling that had been building since that first fever-soaked night when she'd promised to stay until his illness was gone. The next morning brought news from town. A posse was forming to track down a gang that had robbed the bank in neighboring Silver Creek. 3 men had been killed during the robbery, including the sheriff. "They're asking for volunteers," said the young rider who'd brought the news. "Anyone who can ride and shoot." Josephine saw the change in Caleb's demeanor instantly. A tension entered his body, a readiness that hadn't been there before. "When do they ride out?" he asked the messenger. "Dawn tomorrow," the boy replied. Josephine felt her heart sink. "Surely they don't need you," she said to Caleb after the rider had gone. "You're still recovering." "I'm healed enough," he said, checking his revolver with practiced hands. "They'll need experienced men." "It's not your fight," she argued. Caleb holstered his weapon and turned to her, his expression serious. 3 men are dead, Josephine. The next town these outlaws hit could be ours. Your father would have ridden with the posse." She couldn't argue with that. John Sutton had been a man who believed in standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Especially when it was difficult. "Then I'm coming with you," she declared. "Absolutely not." His voice was sharp with sudden fear. "These aren't men to trifle with. I can shoot as well as most men and track better than some," she said stubbornly. "And it's my town too." Their argument continued through dinner and into the evening, neither willing to yield. It was only when Caleb pointed out that the ranch would be vulnerable without someone to watch over it that Josephine reluctantly agreed to stay behind. "I'll be back in a week, 2 at most," he promised as he prepared to leave at first light. "Keep that rifle close while I'm gone." Josephine nodded, fighting back tears she didn't understand. Caleb had only been in her life for a few short weeks. Why did his departure feel like losing a piece of herself? As he mounted his horse, Caleb paused, looking down at her with an expression that made her breath catch. Then, in a move that surprised them both, he leaned down and brushed his lips against hers, a touch so gentle it might have been the wing of a butterfly. "Something to come back for," he murmured against her mouth before straightening in the saddle. Josephine stood in the yard long after he had disappeared from sight, her fingers touching her lips where the ghost of his kiss lingered. The days without Caleb stretched endlessly. Josephine threw herself into ranch work, determined to prove to him and to herself that she could manage on her own. But each night, as she sat alone on the porch where they had shared so many conversations, she found herself watching the road, hoping to see a familiar silhouette. A week passed with no word. Then 10 days. On the 12th day, just as Josephine was considering riding to town for news, a rider appeared. Her heart leapt, then fell as she realized it wasn't Caleb but Micah Jensen, the blacksmith's son. "Miss Sutton," he called as he approached, and something in his voice sent ice through her veins. "There's been trouble." The posse had tracked the outlaws to an abandoned mine in the mountains. There had been a gunfight. 2 of the posse were dead, 3 wounded. The outlaws had scattered. "And Caleb?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Micah's expression was grim. "He went after their leader. No one's seen him since. They found blood trails leading into the high country, but the weather turned, and they had to bring the wounded back. They left him out there." Josephine's voice rose with disbelief and anger. "They searched as long as they could, Miss Sutton. The storm was coming in fast, and the wounded needed care." Micah shifted uncomfortably. "They'll go back out when the weather clears." "When will that be?" "Hard to say. Mountain weather's unpredictable this time of year." Josephine was already moving toward the barn. "I need supplies. Food, bandages. And I'll need to borrow a pack horse if you've got one to spare." Micah dismounted, following her. "Miss Sutton, you can't be thinking of going up there alone. It's dangerous country, and those outlaws are still at large." "I'm not asking for permission, Micah," she said, pulling her saddle from its rack. "I'm asking for a pack horse." No amount of argument could dissuade her. By nightfall, Josephine was riding into the foothills, a borrowed pack horse trailing behind her laden with supplies. She carried her father's rifle across her saddle and a determination in her heart that would not be denied. The journey into the mountains was arduous. The recent storm had left the trails muddy and treacherous, and twice she had to backtrack when her path was blocked by fallen trees or washed-out sections. But each setback only strengthened her resolve. On the second day, she found signs of the gunfight, bullet-scarred trees, trampled underbrush, and ominously, dark stains on the rocks that she knew must be blood. She followed the most promising trail, the one that led higher into the mountains, away from the mine where the initial confrontation had occurred. The blood trail was sporadic but discernible to her experienced eyes. Someone was wounded, bleeding, moving steadily upward. Whether it was Caleb or one of the outlaws, she couldn't be sure, but it was the only lead she had. As dusk fell on the 3rd day, Josephine came upon a small cabin nestled in a grove of pines. Smoke curled from the chimney, and she approached cautiously, rifle ready. The door of the cabin opened before she could decide on her next move, and a figure appeared, rifle raised. "That's far enough," a familiar voice called, though it was edged with pain. "Caleb." Josephine urged her horse forward, heedless of the weapon. "It's me, Josephine." The rifle lowered slowly as she drew closer. Caleb stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on the door frame. His face was pale beneath a layer of trail dust, and a makeshift bandage was wrapped around his left thigh, stained dark with blood. "What in God's name are you doing here?" he demanded, though the relief in his eyes belied his harsh tone. "Looking for you," she said simply, dismounting and moving to his side. "The posse returned without you. They said you'd gone after the gang leader." Caleb allowed her to help him back inside the cabin, which was sparsely furnished but warm from the small fire in the hearth. "I got him," he said as he eased back onto a rough pallet near the fire. "But not before he got me." Josephine examined his wound. A bullet grazed that had torn through muscle but appeared to have missed bone and major vessels. It had been crudely cleaned and bandaged, but was showing signs of infection. "Who does this cabin belong to?" she asked as she began to unpack her supplies. "Old trapper, from the looks of it. Hasn't been used in some time, but the roof's sound, and there was enough dry wood to get a fire going." He watched as she prepared to clean his wound properly. "You shouldn't have come, Josephine. It was foolish." "Perhaps," she conceded, wetting a clean cloth. "But here I am, and here you are, alive, which might not have been the case if I'd listened to everyone telling me what I should and shouldn't do. The cleaning of the wound was a painful process that left Caleb ashen-faced and sweating, but he didn't cry out once. Josephine applied a poultice of herbs she had brought, then wrapped the leg in fresh bandages. "You're good at this," he observed as she worked. "Doctoring. My mother taught me before she passed. Said every ranch wife should know how to mend more than just clothes." She secured the bandage and looked up at him. "There. That should help, but you'll need real medical attention when we get back." "And how do you propose we do that with my leg like this?" Caleb asked, gesturing to his injury. "I can barely stand, let alone ride." "We'll rest here a day or two until you're stronger, then take it slow," she replied. "Unless you'd rather I go for help and leave you here?" The flash of vulnerability in his eyes was answer enough. "No," he said softly. "I'd rather you stayed." They settled into a cautious routine over the next few days. Josephine tended the fire, prepared simple meals from her supplies and what she could hunt nearby, and changed Caleb's bandages twice daily. To her relief, the poultice seemed to be working. The angry redness around the wound began to fade, and Caleb's fever remained low. They talked more freely than they ever had at the ranch, perhaps because their isolation removed the barriers of propriety and expectation. Caleb spoke of his childhood in Missouri, his dreams of owning his own ranch again someday. Josephine shared memories of her mother, her love of the land that had been in her family for 2 generations, and her determination to make the Double S thrive again. On the third night, as they sat before the fire eating a rabbit stew Josephine had prepared, Caleb broached a subject they had both been avoiding. "The man I went after, the leader of the gang, he won't be troubling anyone again," he said, his voice flat. "But his associates might come looking when they realize he's not coming back." Josephine set down her bowl. "You're saying it's not safe to return to town?" "Not immediately, no. And maybe not for me at all." He met her gaze across the fire. "I've made enemies in my time, Josephine. That's the real reason I've drifted so much. Never staying too long in one place means never giving trouble a chance to catch up." "Is that what your wound in Dodge City was really about?" she asked. "Not a disagreement, but someone hunting you?" Caleb nodded slowly. "I was a U.S. Marshal for a time after the war. Made some powerful men very unhappy when I brought their operations to light. One of them has a long memory and deeper pockets." Josephine absorbed this revelation, understanding now why he had been so reticent about his past. "And yet you stayed at the Double S, knowing it might bring danger to our door." "I meant to move on after getting the ranch back on its feet," he admitted. "But then—" He trailed off, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Then," she prompted softly, "then I found something I wasn't willing to walk away from. Someone." His voice was rough with emotion. "I told myself it was safer for you if I left, that my feelings didn't matter. But I'm not sure I'm strong enough to do the right thing anymore." Josephine moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. "What if the right thing isn't leaving? What if it's staying, fighting for what matters?" His fingers tightened around hers. "I've spent so long running. I'm not sure I remember how to stand still." "Then I'll remind you," she said, and leaned forward to press her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a question being asked and answered. Then Caleb's hand came up to cup her face, and the kiss deepened, becoming a conversation of desire and need that had been building since that first day he rode onto her land. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I have nothing to offer you but trouble and a tarnished name," he whispered. "That's not true," Josephine countered. "You have courage, honor, and a heart that cares deeply. Those are worth more than gold to me." They slept that night wrapped in each other's arms before the dying fire, finding comfort in the simple presence of another soul who understood the loneliness of the path they had walked. Morning brought clarity and practical concerns. Caleb's leg was improving, but he was still far from able to manage the difficult journey down the mountain. And with each passing day, the risk of discovery by the remaining outlaws or the man hunting Caleb from his past grew. "We need a plan," Josephine said as she changed his bandage. "A way to get you back to town safely and deal with these threats once and for all." Caleb was silent for a moment, thinking. "There's a U.S. Marshal in Santa Fe I can trust. If I could get word to him about what happened here and about the man who's been hunting me, he might be able to help." How do we contact him? That's the problem. Someone would need to get to Santa Fe, and that's a long journey from here. Josephine considered their options. What if we don't go back to town at all? What if we go directly to Santa Fe? The journey would be arduous, especially with Caleb injured, but it would avoid the immediate danger of returning to a place where people might be watching for them. They spent the day planning, gathering what supplies they could from the cabin and preparing for a journey that would test them both. They set out the next morning, Caleb riding gingerly, his leg bound tightly to minimize movement. Josephine led the way, choosing the easiest paths, stopping frequently to allow him to rest. It was slow going, but with each mile, they put more distance between themselves and the dangers behind them. The journey took them through some of the most beautiful and treacherous terrain of the New Mexico territory. They crossed rushing streams swollen with mountain runoff, navigated narrow trails that clung to cliff sides, and camped in hidden valleys where the stars seemed close enough to touch. And through it all, their bond deepened. The shared hardships and quiet moments of beauty forged something between them that was stronger than the attraction that had first drawn them together. They learned to anticipate each other's needs, to find strength when the other faltered, to share burdens both physical and emotional. On the 5th day of their journey, they encountered a small party of Apache hunters. Josephine feared the worst, knowing the tensions between settlers and the native peoples of the territory. But Caleb spoke a few words in their language, and to her surprise, the lead hunter responded with recognition in his eyes. "You know them?" she whispered as the Apache conferred among themselves. "I helped return the chief's son safely during a conflict some years back," Caleb explained. "It seems word travels, even in the mountains." The Apache offered them shelter for the night, food, and most precious of all, information. The outlaws had indeed been searching for Caleb, but had given up and headed south. And there were rumors of a bounty hunter asking questions in the settlements, a man who matched the description of Caleb's pursuer from Dodge City. "Santa Fe is still our best option," Caleb said that night as they lay side by side in the shelter the Apache had provided. "Marshal Thompson will listen to my story. He can help clear my name and put an end to this hunting." Josephine traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "And then what? Where do we go from there?" The question contained all the uncertainty of their future, all the hopes and fears that had been building since they set out on this journey together. Caleb turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I've been thinking about that, about what comes after, if we're fortunate enough to have an after." He captured her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I want to go home, Josephine. To the double S. With you." The admission, so simple and yet so profound, brought tears to her eyes. "That's what I want too," she whispered. They reached Santa Fe 3 days later, Caleb's leg much improved though still painful, and Josephine's determination undiminished despite the rigors of the journey. They found Marshal Thompson at the territorial office, a grizzled veteran with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Hayes," he said when they were shown in. "Heard you were dead." "Reports exaggerated, as usual," Caleb replied with a weary smile. "I need your help, Frank. It's time to end this." The story took hours to tell, from Caleb's time as a marshal to the corruption he had uncovered, the powerful men he had brought down, and the one who had escaped justice and had been pursuing him ever since. Josephine added her part of the tale, the bank robbery, the gunfight in the mountains, and their journey to Santa Fe. Marshal Thompson listened without interruption, making occasional notes. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Maxwell Thornton," he said, naming the man who had been hunting Caleb. "He's expanded his operations since your time. Railroads, mining interests, and still the same old cattle rustling and land grabbing that made him rich in the first place." He tapped his pen against the desk. "But he's gotten careless. We've been building a case against him for months." Hope flared in Caleb's eyes. I mean your testimony could be the final piece we need," Thompson confirmed. "And in return, I might be able to arrange for some protection until Thornton is behind bars where he belongs." The process wasn't swift or simple. There were depositions to give, evidence to corroborate, and the careful construction of a case that would stand up to the expensive lawyers Thornton would undoubtedly employ. Through it all, Josephine remained at Caleb's side, her presence a constant reminder of why this fight mattered. They stayed in Santa Fe for nearly a month, living in a small room above a quiet cantina, their days filled with meetings and paperwork, their nights with whispered plans for the future. It was a strange limbo, neither fully free nor entirely captive to the past that had driven them there. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. Marshall Thompson arrived at their lodgings one evening with news. Thornton had been arrested in Denver, along with several of his associates. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including testimony from former employees eager to save themselves. "It's over," Thompson told Caleb, clapping him on the shoulder. "You're free to go where you please, do what you will. The bounty on your head has been officially rescinded." That night, Caleb and Josephine walked the streets of Santa Fe, hand in hand under a canopy of stars. The weight that had been pressing on Caleb for so long seemed to have lifted, leaving him standing taller, his steps lighter despite his still healing leg. "So," Josephine said as they paused in the plaza, the cathedral's silhouette dark against the night sky. "Where do we go from here, now that we can go anywhere?" Caleb turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I meant what I said in the mountains. I want to go home to the Double S. I want to build something lasting there, something that's ours." He hesitated, then dropped to one knee before her, wincing slightly at the pressure on his injured leg. "But I won't go back as your hired hand, Josephine. I want to go as your husband, if you'll have me." Tears blurred Josephine's vision as she looked down at the man who had ridden into her life when she needed him most, the man who had fought beside her, suffered with her, and loved her through it all. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I'll have you, Caleb Hayes. Now and always." They were married in the small church near the Double S 2 weeks later, with Marshall Thompson standing as witness alongside a few neighboring ranchers who had known John Sutton. The town's reaction to their return and sudden marriage ranged from shocked disapproval to genuine well-wishes, but Josephine found she cared little for anyone's opinion save the man who now wore her father's ring. Banker Willoughby was particularly put out, having already made plans to acquire the struggling ranch. His displeasure only deepened when Caleb and Josephine announced their intention to expand operations, starting with the purchase of adjoining land that had been lying fallow. "You'll overextend yourselves," Willoughby warned during a tense meeting at the bank. "The drought may have broken, but this is still harsh country. We're aware of the risks," Caleb replied evenly, "and we're prepared for them." The first year was hard, just as they had expected. There were cattle to purchase, crops to plant, and repairs to make to the ranch house, which they had expanded to accommodate the family they hoped to have. But they worked side by side through it all, their partnership as natural in the daylight hours of ranch work as it was in the intimate darkness of their bedroom. Word of Thornton's conviction reached them in the spring, 20 years for corruption, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. It was the final closing of a chapter that had shadowed Caleb's life for so long, and they celebrated with a quiet evening on the porch where they had first begun to know each other. "Do you ever regret it?" Josephine asked as they watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. "Coming to the Double S that day?" "Never," Caleb said without hesitation, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Even when I was lying in that mountain cabin, bleeding and thinking I might die there, I couldn't regret meeting you. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" she asked, turning to look up at him. "Hope," he said simply. "A future worth fighting for." The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising. The Double S flourished under their joint stewardship, becoming one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory. They added a small orchard, a vegetable garden that was Josephine's pride, and expanded the cattle operation to include a breeding program that produced stock sought after throughout the West. Their family grew as well. Their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Josephine's mother, arrived on a stormy night in the second year of their marriage. She was followed 2 years later by a son, John, named for the grandfather he would never know but whose legacy lived on in the land he would someday inherit. Through it all, the midnight feedings and first steps, the cattle drives and droughts, the celebrations and sorrows that make up a life fully lived, Caleb and Josephine remained each other's constant. The bond forged in those desperate days of fever and flight only strengthened with time, deepening into a love that was as essential to them as air. On their 10th anniversary, Caleb surprised Josephine with a small wooden box. Inside lay a delicate silver locket. "Open it," he urged as she ran her fingers over the intricate engraving. Inside were two miniature portraits. One of Caleb as she had first seen him, trail-worn but determined, and one of herself as she had been that day, proud and uncertain at the threshold of her life's great adventure. "To remind us," Caleb said as he fastened the chain around her neck, "of where we began, of what we overcame." Josephine touched the locket, feeling the weight of their shared history, the promise of their shared future. "As if I could ever forget," she murmured, stretching up to kiss him beneath the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting so many years before. In the years that followed, the story of how Josephine had found Caleb soaked in sweat, how he had said it wouldn't last, and how she had promised to stay until it was gone became a family legend, told and retold around the fireplace on winter evenings. Their children would listen wide-eyed, marveling at the courage and determination of their parents, never fully understanding that the true miracle was not the dangers overcome, but the love that had sustained them through it all. And on quiet nights, when the children were asleep and the ranch settled into the peaceful rhythms of darkness, Caleb and Josephine would sometimes sit on their porch, hands clasped as they had been since those first tentative days of knowing one another. They would watch the stars wheel overhead and know, with the deep certainty that comes from a lifetime of choosing each other every day, that some promises are meant to be kept forever. For Josephine had stayed not just until the fever was gone, but through all the seasons of their life together. And Caleb, who had never planned to stay, had found in her arms the home he had always been seeking. Together, they had built something that would outlast them both, a legacy of love as enduring as the land that had brought them together, as vast as the sky above the double S, and as precious as the life they had created from the ashes of what might have been lost. And in the end, that was all that mattered.